Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the show. Oftentimes, people will think about the current premier that is in office, but obviously, there are lots of former premiers. And joining me today to discuss what the real role of a premier is, reflecting on some of her time as Premier of Ontario, is Kathleen Wynne, who served as the 25th Premier of Ontario. So, Kathleen, as I mentioned, we're just going to kind of do an interview on kind of reflecting on your time as premier and also just discussing what it was like being premier. So maybe just I'll first start off with why did you initially want to run for the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party, and why did you want to run to be premier?
Thanks, Wyatt. First of all, thanks for having me on your podcast. It's great to be here with you. And my path to the premier's office was not a direct one. I had never imagined. So when I was your age, when I was in middle school, I never would have thought that I was going to be premier. It wasn't on my radar screen at all. I got involved in politics because of my own kids' school, and I ran to be a school trustee in 1994. I lost that election, but then I ran again in 2000 and became a school trustee. And I kind of thought, Wyatt, that I would be involved at the local level, maybe run for city council one day, but really education was my interest. And then the way I got involved in provincial politics was there was a premier in Ontario called Premier Mike Harris, when my kids were young and in school. And he was doing some things that I really disagreed with in Ontario around education. And that's really what got me involved. That's what made me think, okay, I want to go and try to work at the provincial level in order to be able to make changes in education, because that's where education is funded from. So I got involved. I ran for the Liberal Party. I was a Liberal, and I became an MPP in 2003. And then I served in a number of ministerial portfolios. First of all, I was an MPP for 3 years without being a minister. And then I was asked by Premier McGuinty to be the Minister of Education. I did that for nearly 4 years. And then I was Minister of Transportation, and then I was Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, and as it was called at the time, and Minister of Municipal Affairs. So by the time Premier McGuinty stepped down in 2012, Wyatt, I had been in a whole bunch of ministries. I had spent a lot of time before I was a minister understanding how government worked. And so I decided in 2012 that I would run to be the leader. I was not the person anybody was betting on particularly. Nobody really thought I was going to win, but I decided I wanted to be part of the discussion. And so that's why I ran in 2012. And I had things that I wanted to do. You know, I had changes that I wanted to make in education, in climate, to fight climate change, in social services for people. So that was what made me want to run.
Obviously, you, as you mentioned, you got elected in 2013 as Premier of Ontario. You decided to stay on as an MPP after resigning as leader of the Ontario Liberal Party. But just you said earlier this year, or maybe it was later last year, I'm not 100% sure, that you weren't going to be running for re-election as an MPP. So maybe just talk a little bit about your reasoning for that, and just and whether or not you'll miss being in public service.
Sure. So I became the premier in 2013. That's when the leadership was over. We won an election in 2014 and got a majority government. And so I served for 4 years. And then in 2018, we had a bad election. It was a bad loss. We had been in office as Liberals for 15 years at that time. And so I stepped down as the leader, but you're right, I had won my seat. So I decided to stay as the MPP. And I'm really glad I did, Wyatt, because I've been able to serve the people of Don Valley West for the last 3 and a bit years. And then I will not run again next June. And the reason I have decided that is that it will be 22 years that I will have been in elected office by next year. It's time for somebody new to come in. I think it's important when we've been, it's not just my age. I mean, I'll be 69 next year when the election comes around, but it's not just the age, it's also the amount of time I've been doing this, and my real belief that it's good to leave when it's time for new people to come along, and there's a need for new blood in the party. So that's really the reason. And I guess the second reason is that my family's made a lot of sacrifices. My partner Jane and my kids, and I've got 4 grandkids, and I really do want to. I want to have a life that's more flexible, that I can spend time with them when I choose to. And so that's the other reason. I've also got a mom who's 93, and so I have a lot of family responsibilities, and so that's the other real reason. Will I miss it? I will miss it enormously. I have loved being the MPP for Don Valley West. I have loved serving the people of Ontario, and it's very hard for me actually to step down. It's very hard to let that go, but it's time. And so I will do that.
You mentioned your party's performance in the last election. So obviously, Stephen Del Duca has been working hard with the co-chairs of the platform committee and with the candidates. I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I do believe the majority, or maybe just a large portion of your candidates are women and people of diverse backgrounds. And so so Stephen Del Duca is obviously really trying to rebuild the party. But is there one piece of advice or one thing that you wish you had known in the 2018 election that you can give to Stephen Del Duca?
Stephen's a very accomplished politician. He's been around for a long time. And I think the piece of advice I would give to him is something that he really does understand, which is staying close to the riding associations, making sure that people across the province feel connected. The Liberals across the province really feel connected. I think we had been in government for such a long time that we, in some ridings, not in all ridings, I mean, in my own riding, we stayed very connected to our volunteer base and our membership. But in some ridings, the riding association kind of disappeared, and people were not coming out to volunteer. And I think that that's a big problem for a political party, because a political party is only as strong as the people who are in it. And so making sure that those connections are in place is very, very important.
Obviously, you are still an elected official for the Ontario Liberal Party, and a lot of people still look to you to hear some of your views on some of the current issues. So I'm going to ask you, as you mentioned, you were heavily involved in education. You were Minister of Education. So maybe I'll just ask you a question surrounding schools right now. Obviously, a lot of people are fearing that schools will have to close again. Obviously, we certainly seen that last year. We've seen schools had to open and close on multiple occasions. So just what would you say to maybe a family right now who is nervous about that? And then what would you, obviously you're not a medical professional, so you can't really give any medical advice on it, but what would you say to Doug Ford as to making sure that schools can stay open?
Well, I've been trying to say for nearly 2 years now to Doug Ford what I thought needed to happen, which was I thought he needed to put a lot more money into education. He needed to hire more people. He needed to have a plan for spreading kids out into the community, maybe having different space that kids could be in, so you could have fewer kids in classes. There's a lot of money that this government has not spent, has not invested in education that could have been invested. So I would say to Doug Ford, you need to put the money into education that is necessary. And if that means in some communities actually moving some kids out of a school building and putting them in another building, or giving schools the resources that they need to build outdoor spaces, you need to do that. Because to answer your first question, Wyatt, I really believe that families need to do everything they can to, first of all, keep their kids safe, but secondly, keep them in school if they can. I think that now there's a conversation about rapid testing, and maybe community members could be working together to work with their school boards to get rapid testing in place, so that kids could be ensured that the students that they're in school with are that those kids are healthy. I think there are a number of things, all of which will cost some money. There will need to be some money invested by the government, but I think the government needs to do what it can to keep kids in school, because I'm very worried, Wyatt, about some students who really became disengaged from school because of online learning. And we need those kids back. We need those kids back engaged with their teachers, with their peers, and with all of the support staff who really make the schools run, So that's what I would say. I'm very worried that if we have to shut down again, we're going to lose those kids.
It's definitely very valuable being in a classroom and being able to have interaction with your peers and with your teachers and stuff. But I'll ask you another question, just kind of surrounding your time as premier. Going back to that, what would you say you're most proud of, and just one of your highlight moments as premier of Ontario?
There are so many of those moments. There were big moments, there were moments, for example, when we announced the increase to the minimum wage. I'm very proud that we did that, and there were so many people who benefited from that. But there are some smaller moments that I really think back on. I remember being in Red Lake, in northwestern Ontario, and I was talking to a woman who was working in the Tim Hortons, and she was asking me about tuition for her daughter who wanted to go on to college, and they didn't have a lot of money, and we had not yet announced our free tuition program. But I was able to say to her, we're going to be putting in place a tuition program that's actually going to allow you to allow your daughter to go to college. And she didn't know anything about it, obviously, because we hadn't announced it. And those moments when I realized that the things we were doing were having such a profound effect on people's lives, such a profound impact that was going to change their lives, those are the things I remember. And you're going to have better retirement security because we got the Canada Pension Plan enhanced by working with the federal government. Those things are very important, and they're not necessarily the things that made headlines, but they are what I think of when I think about the work that we did as a government.
Okay, and I'll ask you one final question before we wrap up. Obviously, as we've talked about, the next Ontario election will be in June, which is slowly but surely fast approaching. I believe it's somewhere 200 or so days away, maybe a bit more than that.
I'll take your word for it.
So as we look to the next Ontario election, why do you think you touched on it a little bit before, but why do you think voters in Ontario should give Stephen Del Duca their support, and maybe talk a little bit specifically to people who, let's say, have been lifetime Progressive Conservative voters or lifetime NDP voters? What do you think will be different with the Ontario Liberal Party this time around?
Well, I think that if you look at the record of the Ontario Liberal Party between 2003 and 2018, there was an enormous amount of progress in Ontario. Doug Ford will boast of the strong economy that he created. He's only been in office for 3 and a bit years. That strong economy he inherited from the work that we had done and the people of the province who had built the economy up. COVID has taken a real toll on everyone's lives in this province. And so I think what we need now is we need a government that is going to base their policy on evidence. We've seen through COVID that Mr. Ford is not interested in rational arguments. He is interested in listening to people who who are his friends, people who have something to gain from decisions, particularly things like the environment and development. He has weakened the environmental protections around development. We need a government that understands that the private sector is very important, but also understands that government has a huge role to play in people's lives. And that's who we are as Liberals. And so we need to get back to that center of the political spectrum where policy really is practical and it's based in evidence and it balances the interests of private sector individuals and people who need strong education and strong healthcare. Before COVID hit, the Conservative government in Ontario was cutting education, it was cutting healthcare, it was making very bad decisions about those public institutions. We can't afford that. And so that's why Stephen Del Duca will be a strong contender, and I hope will form government after the next election.
Alrighty, well, Kathleen, thank you so much for joining me, and it was great reflecting and talking with you on your time as Premier, and maybe we'll get to chat again soon, but yeah, thank you again so much for joining me.
You're very welcome, Wyatt. Very impressive, and to all your listeners, thanks for listening to Wyatt.
Thank you.